What starts as a quiet afternoon quickly unravels into something far more sinister when a racist officer targets an elderly black woman thinking she's an easy victim, someone too old, too quiet, too powerless to fight back. But what he doesn't know is that she's not alone, and she's not just anyone. She's the mother of a high-ranking police captain, and what follows is a powerful reckoning that exposes corruption, demands justice, and reminds everyone watching that dignity doesn't bow to a badge. This story is about strength, truth, and the moment karma walks in with a name and a badge of its own. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're watching from. Drop a comment below, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak truth to power. On a quiet Tuesday evening in Wilmington, North Carolina, the air was thick with the smell of magnolia and old pine, the kind of scent that made memories drift back whether you wanted them to or not. The sun was low, washing the modest brick homes in a warm amber hue, casting long, soft shadows over the uneven sidewalks and worn front porches where wind chimes clicked gently in the breeze. Ruth Ellington, 74 years old, and proud of every hard-earned year, stepped carefully down the sidewalk with a canvas tote in one hand and a polished wooden cane in the other. Her pace was slow but steady, her body worn but not broken, and every movement she made carried the quiet dignity of someone who had never allowed the world to define her by its cruelty. The bag on her arm swung gently with each step filled with fresh bread, 2 peaches, and a jar of homemade jam from the church pantry. Nothing extravagant, but enough for supper and a little comfort. Ruth wore a faded lavender dress with tiny white flowers and a cream cardigan despite the heat because the air could change quick after sundown, and she'd long learned to be ready for anything. Her silver hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and her sharp brown eyes scanned the street with the kind of attentiveness that comes from living through decades when not paying attention could cost you. A pair of kids zipped by on bicycles, the smaller one laughing as his shoelace flapped wildly behind him. Ruth gave them a small nod, her lips tugging into a faint smile. She liked seeing children run free without fear, without the weight she had carried since she was younger than them. Up ahead, the corner she had to turn was lined with overgrown grass and a rusted stop sign that had been tilted for years, never quite fixed, but still standing. Ruth shifted the bag on her shoulder and paused a moment, letting her body breathe, feeling the pull in her knees from too many stairs and not enough rest. She wasn't in a rush. These walks, slow, solitary, unremarkable to most, were sacred to her. They gave her space to think, to pray, to remember who she was when the world wasn't watching. "You're still here," she whispered to herself, barely louder than the hum of the streetlight, and that's something. Her thoughts drifted to her son Elijah, always too busy, but always calling. A high-ranking officer now, he'd begged her just last week to let someone drive her around town, even just to the store. "Ma, you don't need to be out there walking by yourself," he'd said over the phone, his voice firm but tired. "I can send someone from the station." Ruth had chuckled softly the way only a mother can when her child thinks they've said something brand new. "Boy, I've been walking these streets longer than you've had a badge," she'd replied, her tone playful but unbending. "Don't start now." A breeze picked up warm and a little damp, rustling the leaves above her and carrying with it the faint scent of charcoal from someone's backyard grill. Somewhere down the block a dog barked once, then quieted. Ruth adjusted her grip on the cane and moved forward, her shoes scuffing gently against the concrete, her breath, even her focus forward. There was peace in this rhythm, in the predictability of movement, and in the way her body still obeyed her when she asked kindly enough. She knew these streets, every crack in the sidewalk, every flickering porch light, every mailbox that leaned too far to the left. They were a part of her story, etched in her memory like the lines on her hands. As she neared her block, a sudden gust carried the heavy perfume of blooming crepe myrtle through the air, and for a moment she stopped, eyes closed, letting it wash over her. It reminded her of summers long gone, of her late husband's cologne of church dresses and cold lemonade on a front step that no longer stood. The ache in her chest wasn't grief exactly, it was memory dense and aching and too sweet to swallow. She opened her eyes slowly and looked around. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Time didn't just pass it, pressed it, shaped it, stole, and it reminded. Ruth turned onto her street just as the sun dipped below the rooflines, painting the sky in bruised purples and soft gold. She could see her porch light flicker ahead, the one Elijah had replaced for her last spring. The steps leading up were chipped at the corners and the railing creaked, but it was home. Her pace slowed further as she neared the gate, her fingers brushing over the cool iron post out of habit. There was no one outside tonight, just the hum of crickets and the hush of a day quietly folding into night. She let herself feel proud for still walking, for still standing, for carrying her own bag, no matter how light or heavy. Her shoulders were tired, but her spirit was firm. The world hadn't always been kind to women like her, but it hadn't taken her down either. As she climbed the steps one at a time, her mind was calm, her breathing slow, and her eyes sharp as ever. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight she had walked her own road, and that in itself was a quiet kind of victory. Just as Ruth reached the midpoint of her block, her cane tapping out its familiar rhythm, the calm of the evening thinned like mist, giving way to something colder, sharper, and less forgiving. Parked just ahead beneath the shadow of a leaning pine tree sat a white cruiser idling with a low mechanical purr that didn't quite match the stillness of the neighborhood. The headlights were off, but the engine growled softly, like a restless animal waiting for permission to lunge, and the figure inside remained motionless until Ruth passed close enough for her outline to cross his windshield. From behind the wheel, Officer Bradley Knox sat slouched, his elbow hooked lazily over the rolled-down window, his fingers drumming against the door in a rhythm that felt deliberate, taunting almost. He was younger than Ruth had expected, maybe late 30s, with a buzzed haircut and a face that had seen too many long nights and not enough accountability. His pale blue eyes tracked her every step with a narrowed intensity not quite hidden behind the casual posture he forced. She felt it the way women like her always did, that chill down the spine when someone's stare lingers too long, too hard, for all the wrong reasons. "Evening, ma'am," he called, his voice dry and sharp like gravel on concrete. Ruth slowed but didn't stop, her fingers tightening slightly around the curve of her cane. "Where you headed this time of night?" His tone wasn't friendly, it was probing, suspicious, lined with a condescension he didn't bother to hide. Ruth turned her head just enough to glance in his direction, her voice calm but firm. "Just heading home. 2 blocks up, same house I've lived in for 40 years. Knox leaned further out the window, one arm dangling over the edge, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Huh, that right," he said, drawing out the words like they were part of a slow game he'd played before. "You carrying anything in that bag I ought to know about?" Ruth kept her posture straight, her voice measured. "Just some bread and peaches. Nothing more, nothing less." Her heart beat a little faster, not from fear, not yet, but from the sick feeling of familiarity. This wasn't new. It was just dressed in another uniform. For a moment, nothing moved. The world held its breath while the two of them faced each other across that narrow strip of sidewalk. Then, with a loud creak and a heavy thud, the car door swung open and Knox stepped out. His boots hit the pavement with a deliberate stomp, the sound too loud for the quiet street, too aggressive to be anything but a message. "Mind if I take a look, ma'am?" he said, already closing the distance between them. Ruth didn't move. She planted her cane, firmly meeting his gaze without flinching. "I do mind," she answered, her voice quiet but full. "And unless you have a reason, an actual reason, there's no call for this." Knox tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was a problem he didn't quite know how to solve, like her calm was something that made him itch. His eyes flicked to the bag, then back to her face. "You got a smart mouth," he said, stepping even closer. "Most people just answer when an officer asks a question. You got something to hide." Ruth exhaled slowly, willing her shoulders to stay loose and her voice to stay steady. "I'm 74 years old. I've been walking this same route since you were in diapers. All I've got in this bag is dinner. If that makes me suspicious, then you've got the wrong lens on your glasses, officer." Her words weren't loud, but they landed like bricks, steady and unyielding. Knox's jaw clenched, his nostrils flaring for a moment before he looked away, as if biting back something uglier than words. The street around them had grown unnaturally quiet. The laughter from the kids on bikes had disappeared, the rustle of leaves now the only sound filling the space between them. Ruth felt the weight of unseen eyes peeking through window blinds, neighbors recognizing the shape of danger, but unsure of their place in it. She could feel the air grow heavier, the kind of heaviness that comes just before a storm, not of weather but of intention. Knox adjusted his belt, his hand resting casually too close to the radio clipped to his shoulder. "I don't like the tone you're using," he said finally, his voice lower, now controlled but tense. "Not one bit. Might have to call this in. Make sure everything checks out. Ruth didn't blink. You can call who you need to, she said, shifting the bag higher on her shoulder, but I won't be intimidated on a sidewalk I helped build. That was when something in Knox's posture changed, subtle but unmistakable. His smile disappeared, entirely replaced by a tight, expressionless stare. He stepped back slightly, nodding once as if filing something away. All right, he said. Have it your way. Then after a beat he added, but don't think I won't be keeping an eye on you. He turned, slowly returned to his car without another word, and slid back into the seat with the engine still purring beneath him. Ruth stood still for a few moments longer, her hand white-knuckled around the cane, her breath slow but deliberate. She listened to the engine, the low growl that hadn't left since she passed it the first time, and then finally she took another step forward. The weight in her chest hadn't left, but she walked anyway, step by step, cane by cane, because giving in to fear was something she'd never learned how to do. By the time she reached her front gate, the cruiser was still there, headlights off the silhouette inside, watching. But Ruth didn't look back. She just unlocked her gate with slow, steady fingers, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind her with a click that sounded like a full stop. The moment Officer Knox stepped fully onto the sidewalk, something about the air shifted, barely noticeable to the untrained, but unmistakable to someone like Ruth, who had spent a lifetime reading danger before it ever announced itself. He wasn't just posturing anymore. His movements had taken on the heaviness of intent, the kind that makes shoulders tighten and hearts beat harder than they should. He didn't ask questions this time, just stared at her with a smile, so thin it looked carved his hands, resting near his belt, just shy of his baton. Ruth stopped walking, not because he told her to, but because experience taught her that sometimes stillness was the strongest answer you could give a man looking to provoke. She adjusted the strap of her grocery bag with a calm she didn't entirely feel, and met his gaze with a steadiness that had silenced men more dangerous than him. I told you I'm going home, she said, her voice even, and unless you've got a reason to stop me, I suggest you let me be. Knox took a slow step forward, then another, each one deliberate, each one narrowing the distance, in a way that felt less like procedure and more like pressure. And I told you, he said, his tone now slick with mockery, you look suspicious. Old lady walking around here after dark, bag full of something you won't let me see. That's plenty of reason for a stop. Ruth exhaled slowly through her nose, her fingers tightening just slightly around the curve of her cane, not as a threat, but as a reminder of her own strength. Her knees ached the weight of the bag pulling on her shoulder, but her voice didn't falter. Suspicious to you, she said, is just another way of saying I don't belong in my own neighborhood. For a heartbeat, Knox didn't move, just stared at her with an expression that hovered somewhere between amusement and contempt. Then without warning, he reached out and yanked the grocery bag from her arm. The canvas strap burned across her skin as it slipped from her shoulder, and the sudden imbalance made her stumble back a step, one foot twisting slightly on the edge of the uneven pavement. Knox turned the bag over in one smooth, aggressive motion, spilling its contents onto the sidewalk, with the flourish of a magician revealing a trick. Except there was no surprise here, only smashed peaches, a cracked jar of jam, and a loaf of bread now torn open and flattened beneath his boot. Looks like you've been shopping for trouble, he sneered, grinding his heel into the fruit until it split beneath him with a wet, muffled sound. Ruth stared down at the mess in silence, her jaw tightening as the smell of bruised peaches and street dust rose around her. Her voice came low and firm. That's my dinner, officer. Knox looked up, his smirk widening like a man who'd finally gotten the reaction he wanted. That right, he said, nudging the broken jar with the toe of his boot. Sure don't look like much now. The sound of a screen door creaking open across the street made them both glance up for a brief second. An older man in a bathrobe peered out from behind a porch column, then quickly slipped back inside the door, clicking shut with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any shout might have. Ruth felt it then, that slow, smothering isolation that comes not from being alone but from being seen and left alone anyway. Knox saw it too. His eyes flicked back to hers, his grin losing any pretense of humor. People around here don't seem too interested in your little show, he said. Guess they know better than to get involved. She took a half step forward, her cane tapping lightly as she found her footing again. They know better, she said softly, because they've seen what happens when someone stands up. Her eyes didn't waver. But I've never been much for standing down. Knox's smile thinned. He stepped closer, his body now just inches from hers, the sour scent of sweat and cheap cologne mixing with the sticky sweetness of crushed fruit on the sidewalk. His hand hovered near her elbow, his breath hot against her cheek. "You've got two choices," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "You can get on your knees and apologize for wasting my time, or I can help you down and write this up as resisting arrest. Your call." Ruth didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for anything but her dignity. "I'm not getting on my knees for you," she said. "Not now, not ever." For a second he just stood there as if weighing her words in the air between them, his jaw twitching slightly, a vein pulsing at his temple. Then without warning he grabbed her wrist, the grip hard enough to bruise and twisted. Her cane fell with a hollow clatter against the pavement as her knees buckled. She cried out not in fear but from the jolt of pain that shot up her arm and through her back. Her body, still strong, couldn't bear weight on one leg, now twisting beneath her. Knox didn't pause. He shoved her the rest of the way down with one hard push, and she landed on the sidewalk with a force that rattled her bones. The cold concrete scraped her palms, the sharp edges of gravel digging into her skin. The smell of the pavement, hot and bitter, rose up around her. Her breath came short and shallow. Knox loomed above his shadow, swallowing the last bit of light, as the sun fully dipped beyond the rooftops. Her groceries lay scattered beside her, crushed and dirty, a portrait of ruin painted with quiet violence. She didn't speak, didn't plead. She looked up at him, breathing through the pain, and said only, "My name is Ruth Ellington. Remember it." The way one might etch a name into stone. And in that moment, though, her body was lowered, her spirit stood 10 feet tall. The pavement pressed hard against Ruth's knees, sharp and unrelenting, each second spent kneeling, deepening the sting in her bones, and stealing something sacred that words couldn't quite name. Her cane lay out of reach, tipped on its side like a silent witness, its handle catching the fading light as if it too were too stunned to move. Around her the world stood still, the air thick with silence, and something darker, something heavy, and watching like the whole block had collectively held its breath, and decided it was safer not to exhale. The sour odor of Officer Knox's breath lingered close to her ear, hot and thick, with the stench of unchecked power, and when he crouched beside her, his boots scuffing across crushed bread and broken fruit, she could hear the quiet pleasure curling around his voice. "You think you're strong, huh?" he muttered, his hand tightening around her upper arm, where skin had already begun to bruise. "Think you're better than me just because you've got a smart mouth and a little pride left." His fingers dug deeper, and Ruth winced not from the pain but from the weight of what was coming, because she had seen men like him before years ago, different uniform, same hatred tucked behind a badge. She didn't answer. She didn't flinch. And that, more than anything, seemed to ignite something in him. Knox stood, pulled off one of his boots with a quick, angry motion, and held it out in front of her face. The sole was caked in dry mud black from the street, and flecked with traces of gravel and grass, and it hovered there just inches from her lips like a grotesque offering. "You want to walk around like you're somebody," he said, voice flat and dangerous. "Then show me who you really are. Go on, lick it." For a moment nothing moved. Not the wind, not the streetlight buzzing overhead, not the leaves on the trees that lined the sidewalk behind her. Even the insects had gone quiet, their song cut short by the ugliness of what was unfolding. Ruth stared at the boot, her body still, but her mind racing in quiet, pulsing waves of fury and disbelief. She had survived. Jim Crow watched friends and family disappear under systems too cold to hold names, and buried a husband who used to squeeze her hand every time he saw a cop car pass. She had worked 2 jobs, paid off a house, raised a son who now wore his own badge, and stood for the kind of law she believed still might exist. And here she was on a public sidewalk in her own neighborhood, being told to put her lips on the boot of a man who saw her as less than human. "I won't," she whispered, her throat, dry voice trembling only from exhaustion. "I won't do that." Knox's eyes narrowed and his jaw clenched. "You don't get to say no," he said, gripping her chin with one hand and twisting her face toward the leather. "You people always forget your place. I'm just reminding you." His grip was hard, bruising, his thumb digging into the soft skin beneath her jaw as he pushed the sole closer. The smell hit first earthy and chemical, a mixture of asphalt and sweat, and then the pressure, the rubber edge pressing against her lower lip like a brand. Ruth gagged instinctively, a rush of bile rising in her throat, her body rejecting what her spirit refused to accept. "Don't make me do this," she whispered, her words muffled. But he didn't let up. "Do it," he snapped, voice sharp enough to cut glass. So she did. Not because she broke, not because she gave up, but because her body couldn't take another shove, and she needed to survive this moment to tell someone later. She closed her eyes and let the tip of her tongue graze the surface, the texture gritty, bitter, unnatural. She felt it coat her mouth like poison, and she forced herself not to choke. Knox laughed, then loud and satisfied, like a child who had broken something just to see the pieces fall. "That's right," he said, jamming the boot back onto his foot. "Know your place." Ruth didn't cry. She didn't yell. She didn't reach for her cane or for her groceries, or for a word that might explain what had just happened. She sat back on her heels, wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand, and looked up at him with eyes that burned not from shame, but from a deep, ancient kind of clarity, the kind that doesn't ask for justice, but waits for it with quiet certainty. Across the street, a neon sign flickered in the window of a closed barber shop, its blue and red light reflecting faintly in a puddle where a peach had rolled, now split open and seeping juice into the dust. Somewhere nearby, a door creaked, then shut again. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. Knox stood tall, arms folded, his smirk carved across his face like graffiti on a church wall. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. He thought he'd won. Thought he'd claimed something he could brag about, twist into a joke later when the shift ended and the drinks started pouring. Ruth saw it in the way he rolled his shoulders, the way he turned back toward his cruiser like a man who'd just done a job well done. But she stayed kneeling for just a moment longer, not because she was weak, but because she needed the weight of the moment to settle fully into her bones. She wanted to remember every second, every word, every step of her dignity being trampled, not to bury it, but to build something out of it later. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself upright, her knees, aching, her palms scraped and stinging her breathing, shallow but steady. Her cane was still on the ground a few feet away, but she didn't move to grab it yet. Instead, she stood as straight as her spine would allow, adjusted her cardigan, and stared at the back of the man who had just tried to erase her. "You'll regret that," she said, quietly, not as a threat but as a truth. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she walked to where her groceries lay, ruined, crouched slowly, and began gathering what was left, because dignity once shaken can still be reclaimed. Even from the sidewalk, even after the world pretends not to see. The moment the black SUV turned the corner, tires biting into the pavement, engine humming low like a warning, every head on that quiet street turned instinctively toward it. The cruiser's lights weren't flashing, but there was something unmistakably deliberate in the way it rolled in, like it belonged here, and yet didn't, like it had come with purpose, and not by chance. Officer Knox was still standing over Ruth, arms crossed, chin lifted, that smug look cemented into his face like it had grown there over time. But as the SUV came to a stop and the door on the driver's side swung open, the look began to shift almost imperceptibly at first, as if the certainty in his bones had just been tapped, and suddenly, he wasn't sure if he was still in control. The man who stepped out wasn't tall in the way that demands attention, but in the way that commanded it. He didn't slam the door or raise his voice. He didn't stride or stomp. He simply walked, one hand resting on his hip, the other brushing his jacket closed, and every step toward Ruth made the space between her and Knox feel smaller, tighter, heavier with consequence. His navy blue suit was crisp despite the creases near the waist, and his badge gleamed from beneath his lapel like it had earned the right to shine. But it wasn't the clothes or the title that silenced the street. It was the look in his eyes. "Ma," he said, his voice low and tight, as if every syllable was being forced through clenched teeth and an even tighter heart. "You all right?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She stood beside her scattered groceries, hand, still trembling from what she had just endured, her pride still bleeding somewhere behind her ribs. But when her eyes met his, something softened in her face, not a retreat, but a release. "You got here fast," she murmured, and that was all she needed to say. Knox took a step back then, as if the gravity of the moment had shifted beneath his boots, and he wasn't sure how to regain balance. His hand instinctively touched the edge of his utility belt, but he didn't reach for anything, just lingered there, uncertain. The newcomer turned to face him, posture calm, but filled with an unmistakable kind of quiet threat. "Officer Bradley Knox," he said, like he was reciting from memory, not inquiry. "You know who I am?" Knox didn't answer. Not at first. But his jaw moved and his eyes flicked to the nameplate, then back to the man's face. "Captain Ellington," he muttered finally, and the words landed on the sidewalk like loose change dropped in a moment of panic. "That's right," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "Captain Elijah Ellington, commander of this precinct as of last month." His eyes narrowed just slightly. "And also the son of the woman you just assaulted." The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it had weight. It pressed into every corner of the street, filled the cracks in the pavement, settled into the hearts of every witness watching from behind their curtains. Knox didn't move, didn't speak. His body stood still, but his face betrayed a flicker of something: confusion, calculation, or maybe the earliest seeds of fear. Ruth could feel it too. Not vengeance, not satisfaction, but the first breath of justice brushing past her cheek like a wind she hadn't felt in a long time. Elijah walked forward slowly, eyes not leaving Knox's. "You put your hands on my mother," he said, every word like a nail driven into wood. "You humiliated her, dumped her food on the street, and forced her to kneel." He paused, his breath steady. "You think that's going to stand?" Knox straightened his spine, trying to recover the posture of authority, but it no longer fit him. "She was being non-compliant," he said. "Gave me attitude. Refused to answer basic questions." Elijah blinked once, then nodded, almost as if giving the man a chance to hang himself with his own rope. "So you decided to escalate. You decided to punish her." He glanced toward the groceries on the ground, the bruised fruit, the split jar leaking its sweetness into the dust. "You decided to play God on my block." "She made me do it," Knox said quickly, too quickly. "These people, they push back. They don't respect the badge anymore." Elijah's voice dropped low, dangerously low. "Number. You don't respect the badge. You think it gives you power. It doesn't. It gives you responsibility." He turned slightly, half facing his mother now, and the edge in his tone eased just a breath. "You okay to stand?" Ruth nodded, her hand tightening on the handle of her cane as she slowly lifted herself upright. Her knees still ached and her back burned where the concrete had kissed it too hard, but her voice didn't shake. "I've stood through worse," she said. "But not while my son was watching." Elijah helped her steady, one hand gentle on her elbow, and the two of them turned fully to face Knox. "You're suspended pending investigation," Elijah said, clearly loud enough for the neighbors to hear, for the windows to remember. "Turn in your badge and your weapon. Right here. Right now." Knox looked around as if searching for a lifeline, but none came. Even the shadows had pulled back from him, ashamed to be near. With stiff hands, he unclipped his badge, laid it in Elijah's open palm, and then unsnapped his holster, laying the service pistol beside it. His face was stone, but the kind that crumbles under pressure, not the kind that withstands it. Ruth didn't say anything more. She just looked at him, her eyes holding a silence that no apology could enter. She adjusted her cardigan once more, then looked down at her ruined food, at the peach that had burst open, glistening in the last rays of sunlight. With the toe of her shoe, she nudged it gently to the side. And then, with Elijah at her side, she turned away from Officer Knox, from the cracked sidewalk, from the sting in her knees and the bile in her throat, and walked slowly toward the SUV that had brought her son to her. The weight of what had happened didn't leave her shoulders, but for the first time that evening, it felt like someone else was carrying it with her. Behind them, the sky darkened, the street exhaled, and the quiet began to rearrange itself. Captain Elijah Ellington stood in the middle of the street, his polished shoes planted firmly on the cracked asphalt, his hands still holding the badge and service weapon he'd just stripped from Officer Knox. The weight of the objects was nothing compared to the heaviness that had settled in his chest, the kind that made it hard to breathe, not from panic but from restraint. He hadn't shouted, hadn't raised a fist, hadn't said the dozens of things clawing at the back of his throat, and that made the restraint harder to carry than the rage itself. Around him the air buzzed with a strange stillness, the kind that follows a storm when neighbors pull curtains back half an inch to check for damage, to make sure the wreckage stayed at someone else's door. Ruth stood beside him, her back straight, one hand clutching the handle of her cane like it was more than just wood and polish, like it was memory and backbone, forged into something that still kept her upright. Her face remained calm, but Elijah could read the tension behind her lips, the tightness in her jaw, the way her free hand wouldn't stop trembling, even when she tucked it against her hip. "You didn't have to do that in front of them," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah turned to her slowly, his eyes softening. "No, Ma," he replied, "I did. Because they needed to see who he was. And who you still are." They walked toward his SUV in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because saying anything might have broken the thin thread of composure still holding the moment together. As they reached the passenger side, Elijah opened the door, gently pausing as Ruth settled herself into the seat with a small grunt, her body stiff and sore, her breath catching slightly as she adjusted the seatbelt. The scent of leather and faint cologne filled the car along with the low hum of the engine, and for a brief second it felt like they were leaving the world behind. But Elijah didn't start the car. Not yet. He stood there for a moment, one hand resting on the open door, staring at the reflection of his mother in the side mirror. "I don't know how to carry this," he said more to himself than to her. Ruth looked up, her voice calm but resolute. "You carry it like we always have," she said, "with your head high and your mouth shut until it matters most." He nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. Back on the sidewalk, Officer Knox stood where Elijah had left him, now flanked by 2 patrol officers from another unit. Their faces were unreadable, their hands busy, logging evidence, taking statements, asking him to repeat his version of events, none of which aligned with the bruises on Ruth's arms or the tears in her bag. Knox's shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the way a man folds in on himself when the uniform no longer shields him, when the authority he once wore like armor begins to peel away in layers. Elijah finally slid into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirror out of habit, and pulled the SUV away from the curb with a slow, steady turn of the wheel. The cruiser behind them didn't move. The street didn't cheer. But Ruth, for the first time that night, allowed her eyelids to close for more than a blink. "You okay?" Ma Elijah asked as they passed the corner where it had all started. She didn't open her eyes. "I will be," she said. "Not today. But soon." They drove through the neighborhood in silence, the headlights catching glimpses of trimmed hedges, shuttered porches, and the occasional light left on behind thick curtains. Elijah's mind kept returning to that moment, seeing her on the ground, her dress stained, her cane too far from reach, her face turned not in defeat but in defiance. The image burned itself into his memory with a clarity he knew would haunt him for years, a snapshot of helplessness colliding with duty, a mother brutalized, and a son forced to wear 2 uniforms at once. The SUV turned onto their street, the houses here smaller but more familiar, the fences leaning and the grass a little overgrown but everything still intact. Elijah pulled into the driveway, cut the engine, and let the quiet settle around them like a blanket they weren't quite ready to fold away. Ruth shifted in her seat, her eyes tracing the outline of her front porch. "You think they'll come back?" she asked, not out of fear but calculation. Elijah looked toward the road, the darkness stretching in either direction like a question with no clean answer. "I think they never really left," he said. "They just wait until the world forgets, then knock again." She nodded, and for a moment they just sat there, neither one reaching for the door handle, neither one ready to be back in the place where they were supposed to feel safest. Finally, Elijah got out, walked around, and helped her out of the car, his arms steady beneath hers. "Let me take a look at your knees," he said, guiding her up the porch steps, his eyes scanning the bruises with a tenderness that made her flinch more than the pain. "They'll heal," she muttered, brushing him off gently. "It's what's underneath that'll take longer." They entered the house, the familiar creak of the floorboards, greeting them like an old friend, the smell of lemon polish, and something faintly sweet, still lingering from yesterday's baking. Elijah helped her sit, then knelt to retrieve the bag that had once held dinner, now torn and empty on the hallway floor where he'd tossed it. "I'll go get something," he said. "Don't worry about that." Ruth leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the window where the porch light flickered once, then steadied again. "I'm not worried," she said. "I'm just tired." Elijah placed the broken bag gently on the counter, then turned back to her. For the first time that night, his posture softened the tension in his shoulders, loosening just enough to show how close he had come to unraveling. "You didn't deserve that," he whispered. Ruth looked at him, eyes full of a knowing that had weathered more than just one bad night. "No one ever does," she replied. "But we survive it anyway." The room fell quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of something withheld. It was the kind that follows truth when it finally has space to land. And in that stillness, as the hum of the refrigerator blended with the distant sound of passing cars, Ruth closed her eyes and let her breath deepen, not in surrender, but in recovery, because even dignity once cracked could be pieced back, together with enough time and enough love. The morning after felt quieter than it should have, not in the peaceful way of a neighborhood recovering, but in the uneasy way of a place holding its breath, unsure what would happen next. The sun rose behind a gauze of thin clouds, casting a pale light over Ruth's street, illuminating the cracks in the sidewalk and the smudges left behind where her groceries had fallen like evidence the rain hadn't come to wash away. Elijah stood in her kitchen with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, eyes unfocused as he stared out the window toward the street that had betrayed his mother's safety. The badge on his chest felt heavier this morning, not because of its weight, but because of the questions it now forced him to ask. He had worn the uniform for nearly 20 years, had given more to the department than it ever gave back, had risen through the ranks not because of favors or family name, but because he played the game smarter and cleaner than most. And yet, as he watched his mother settle into her favorite chair, rubbing the bruises on her arm with the sleeve of her cardigan, Elijah knew something had cracked beneath the surface, and it wasn't going to heal with just paperwork and procedure. "Internal Affairs will look into it," he said, more to the air than to her, his voice low, distant, strained. "They'll see what happened." Ruth didn't respond right away. She sipped her tea, then glanced up at him with a knowing that felt older than either of them. "You trust them to do the right thing?" she asked gently, not as a challenge but as a mother trying to help her son find his own truth. Elijah exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "I trust the process," he said. But the words landed flat hollow, like they didn't believe themselves either. He set the cup down untouched. "But I don't trust Knox to go down without trying to drag others with him. He's not just arrogant, he's protected. That's what worries me." And it was true. Knox hadn't flinched when Elijah confronted him, hadn't pleaded, hadn't shown an ounce of the panic one might expect from a man caught red-handed. No, instead he had smirked just faintly, like he knew something Elijah didn't like. He had already made the call before the badge was taken, like this was a game of chess, and Elijah had only just stepped onto the board. By noon, the rumors had already started. A sergeant down in traffic control mentioned hearing that Knox might file a complaint, claiming Elijah overstepped, claiming Ruth initiated contact. Another officer, one Elijah, had trained personally, avoided eye contact in the hallway. And then there were the two men in plain clothes, loitering outside the precinct parking lot, talking just a little too casually by a black sedan that didn't belong to any of the patrol fleet. Elijah wasn't paranoid, he was experienced. He knew the signs, the whispers, the sudden policy memos, the way a report you'd submitted disappeared and reappeared 2 days later with a new signature at the bottom. He had seen how the system defended its own, not based on truth, but based on proximity and fear. It wasn't about the law, it was about who was willing to lie the loudest, and who had someone powerful enough to co-sign the story. So he moved quietly, carefully. He backed up bodycam data to an off-site drive. He called an old friend at City Records and requested copies of all disciplinary actions related to Knox in the last 5 years. And he began reviewing every complaint that had ever been dismissed with a shrug and a signature trying to spot the pattern beneath the surface. That night he stayed late at the station. The precinct was dim and half-empty, the sound of clacking keys echoing down the hallway like distant gunfire. He sat alone in his office, stacks of files surrounding him, a desk lamp casting shadows that stretched across his nameplate, and over the framed photo of his mother from 2 years ago, smiling, vibrant, unshaken. The contrast between that image and what he had seen just a day ago burned at the edges of his patience, and every time he blinked, her trembling hand returned her whispered, "I won't do that," echoing louder than any siren. A knock broke the silence. It was Officer Green, young, sharp, still unbroken by the machine. She hesitated at the door. "Sir," she said, "I thought you should know. Someone pulled the camera feed from your mother's street. Logged in as maintenance, but the timestamp doesn't match the system's auto backup." Elijah didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded and closed the folder in front of him. "Thanks, officer," he said, his tone unreadable. Green lingered. "For what it's worth, a lot of us saw what happened. We know you didn't do anything wrong." He looked up at her, something in his expression softening. "That's the thing," he said. "Doing the right thing doesn't stop them from twisting it into the wrong thing." She left without replying, and Elijah sat back, staring at the ceiling tiles like they might offer answers. Somewhere in this building, Knox had allies, men and women who'd decided silence was safer, who'd covered for him before, and might do it again. Maybe not out of loyalty, but out of fear of what they'd lose, or what might come to light if they started digging too deep. By midnight he was home again. Ruth had gone to bed, though the blanket on the couch suggested she hadn't stayed there long. Elijah walked through the darkened kitchen, his footsteps soft against the tile, his mind replaying every detail of that day over and over, searching for something he might have missed. He paused at the window, looking out at the street where it all began. It looked the same now, quiet, still familiar, but he knew better. Beneath the surface there were fractures running through the system like hairline cracks in glass, invisible until the pressure became too much and everything shattered at once. He stood there for a long time, the street lamp flickering faintly above, and thought about the oath he'd taken the uniform. He wore the people who trusted him to protect them. And he wondered not for the first time if justice was still something they served, or just something they wrote on the wall because it sounded good next to the city seal. Then he turned off the light, locked the door behind him and climbed the stairs, one slow step at a time, not because he was tired, but because the weight of the day demanded he carry it to the very top before setting it down. In that stillness before sleep he realized something: he wasn't just fighting for his mother. He was fighting for what the badge was supposed to mean, and for the silence that had lasted too long in rooms, too quiet to challenge it. By the time the false charges were filed and entered into the system, the story had already begun to reshape itself behind closed doors, quietly, strategically, with just enough official language to cover the cruelty. Officer Knox, stripped of his badge, but not his reach, had wasted no time pulling favors, whispering into the ears of men who'd known him for years and owed him even more. Within 24 hours, a warrant had been quietly issued under claims of resisting arrest and assaulting an officer with a supplemental charge of obstruction of justice, hastily added in for weight. It didn't matter that none of it made sense, that there were witnesses or video or bruises in all the wrong places. What mattered was that the system had already started folding itself around the lie like armor built from protocol. Ruth was taken from her home just after 7 in the morning. 2 officers came in a marked car, both younger than Elijah, both avoiding her eyes as they stood at her porch with polite words and firm hands. One of them, Officer Levin, looked like he'd barely finished academy, and the way his voice wavered when he said her name told her everything she needed to know. "Miss Ellington," he began, "we've got a warrant signed this morning. We're going to need you to come with us." Ruth didn't argue. She didn't cry or shout or demand anything. She just stood quietly in her doorway, one hand gripping the frame, the other clutching the sleeve of her cardigan. "Do you even know what they're accusing me of?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with the disbelief only someone seasoned in injustice could carry. Levin cleared his throat and looked down at the paper in his hand. "It says you struck an officer and interfered with an investigation," he replied too quickly, as if speed might make it sound less absurd. Her laugh was soft and dry, barely more than a breath. "At 74 years old," she said, with a cane and a bag of peaches. She shook her head and stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her without looking back. They didn't cuff her, perhaps out of pity, perhaps because they feared the optics, but they didn't apologize either. They drove her to the station in silence. The radio turned off the sound of tires against asphalt, the only thing filling the space between them. Ruth stared out the window the entire way, watching her neighborhood recede into the distance, the early morning light stretching long across the fences and porch steps of houses that looked the same, but suddenly felt foreign. Inside the station, the air was thick with familiarity that now felt strange. Elijah wasn't there. He'd been placed on leave pending review, and the absence of his presence hung like a shadow over every corridor she was led through. A different desk sergeant processed her, one she didn't know by name but had seen once or twice at city events. He wouldn't meet her gaze either. Her fingerprints were taken, and her belongings placed into a plastic bag with her name scrawled across the label in black marker. The cell they led her to was small and windowless, lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb that buzzed louder than it shone. She sat on the narrow bench, with her hands folded in her lap, not out of nervousness, but out of discipline, the same posture she had used when sitting through church sermons, school board meetings, or long waits in county buildings, where being black and composed was often the first line of defense. She didn't pace. She didn't complain. She simply sat and listened to the sound of voices in the hallway, the occasional rattle of keys, the rhythm of boots echoing on tile floors. There was power in stillness, and Ruth had mastered it long ago. Meanwhile, Elijah was moving fast but carefully. Even without access to his office or the badge that had once opened doors for him, he still had allies, people who believed in truth, not just policy. He called Grace Harper, a civil rights attorney with a sharp tongue and a sharper mind, who had once promised him that if anything ever happened to his mother, she'd be on the first train into town. True to her word, she arrived that afternoon, all gray blazer and braided hair and a briefcase that looked like it could bite. She met Ruth in the holding room with eyes that didn't blink and a voice that didn't flinch. "Miss Ellington," she said, setting her bag on the table, "I've read the report. It's trash. But we're going to have to dig deeper. This isn't just about one bad officer anymore. It's about the ones helping him hide." Ruth nodded once. "I know," she said. "I could feel them tightening the net before they even knocked on my door." Grace reached across the table and squeezed her hand, not out of pity but out of recognition. "Then we cut through it," she replied, thread by thread. Outside, the precinct protesters had started to gather, quiet at first, then louder, a slow crescendo of outrage and disbelief that began as whispers on Facebook and church bulletins, and grew into bodies holding signs in the afternoon. Heat. News vans rolled up by 5 o'clock. Microphones were raised, stories were told. The footage that had been recorded from across the street, the one showing Knox towering over Ruth, sneering, barking, shoving, surfaced online within hours, and it didn't take long for it to spread. The narrative was changing again, but this time not in the department's favor. Back in her cell, Ruth rested her head against the cool wall, the hum of voices outside reaching her in bits and pieces. Someone had chanted her name. Someone else had held up a sign that read, "We see you, Miss Ruth." She closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, not as validation but as reminder. She hadn't been crazy. She hadn't imagined it. The world really had turned against her. And yet here it was, inching back toward the truth, pulled not by justice itself, but by the people who refused to forget. At 7:30, the officer returned to unlock the door. His eyes still didn't meet hers, but his voice was quieter now. "You're being released. No charges today." Ruth stood slowly, her legs stiff from the hours on the bench. She straightened her sweater, brushed her palms over her skirt, and walked out without asking for help. In the hallway, Grace stood waiting, flanked by Elijah, whose jaw was still tight with fury, but whose eyes softened the moment he saw her. "You good, Ma?" he asked gently. Ruth looked at both of them, then toward the door where she could already hear the growing noise of support and confrontation outside. "I will be," she said. "We're not finished yet. But I'm not walking out of here small." She stepped past them shoulders, square, the sound of chanting growing louder as she neared the exit. And as the glass doors slid open and the evening light spilled in, Ruth Ellington walked back into the world, not as a victim, but as a woman who had weathered the storm, bruised but never broken. The cell was cold, the kind of cold that didn't just come from concrete and steel, but from something deeper, something intentional. It had no windows, no clock, and no sound, except for the quiet hum of a fluorescent light that flickered every so often like a faulty heartbeat overhead. Ruth sat on a narrow bench, bolted to the wall, her back straight, but aching, her hands folded neatly in her lap, like she was sitting in a church pew instead of a holding cell. She had counted the hours in her mind, not by the ticking of a clock, but by the shifts in the hallway, the footsteps, the change in voices, the smell of coffee that drifted in during what she assumed was morning, and the silence that followed just before night. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. She had seen fear before, felt it creeping under her skin during marches in back rooms of courthouses, in the long moments waiting for doctors to tell her news she didn't want to hear. This wasn't fear. This was something heavier and more exhausting. This was knowing that even when you did everything right, even when you were quiet and polite and held your head high, someone could still twist your dignity into a lie and make it look legal. And now she was here wearing the weight of false accusations like a shroud, with her body bruised, and her name suddenly tarnished, and nothing but silence to answer her questions. The door clanked open without warning, and she blinked once at the sudden intrusion of light. A young officer stepped inside, eyes cautious, hands loose at his sides. "You've got a visitor," he said, his voice hesitant, as if unsure whether she'd believe him. Ruth rose slowly, her joints stiff from hours on the hard bench, but her composure unwavering. She followed him through the dim hallway, past rows of locked doors and quiet desks, until they reached a private room with a thick glass panel and a metal table bolted to the floor. Inside, Jamal sat waiting, his face drawn, his hair slightly messier than usual, eyes red from lack of sleep or something worse. The moment he saw her, he stood up quickly, the legs of his chair scraping against the tile. "Miss Ruth," he breathed. "Jesus, are you okay?" Ruth smiled faintly, not out of joy but from sheer gratitude that someone had asked a question without agenda. "I'm here," she said, pulling the chair back with the grace of someone who refused to let steel walls define her presence. "And I suppose that's something." They sat across from each other in silence for a moment, the air between them thick with things that didn't need to be said. Jamal had been there that day. He had raised his phone, had shouted, had risked his own safety to speak truth into a moment designed to erase it. And now here he was sitting across from the woman he tried to protect, wondering if it had made any difference at all. "They're trying to break you," he finally said, his voice tight, low, nearly cracking. "And it's not right." Everyone saw what happened. Ruth leaned forward slightly, her palms resting against the cool metal. "Seeing and believing are two different things, baby," she said gently. "And belief don't always come easy when power is doing the talking." Jamal shook his head, a bitter chuckle escaping his throat. "They smashed my phone. Took the only proof I had. I went to file a complaint, and the officer at the front desk looked at me like I was the problem." Ruth nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "That's what they count on," she said. "They count on people getting tired, getting quiet, giving up." Jamal's eyes flashed, then not with anger but with something deeper, resolve tempered by confusion. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "I thought maybe if I filmed it, if I yelled loud enough, if I showed the world, they'd have to stop." She reached out then, her hand covering his across the table, and in that moment the cold of the room receded just a little. "You did more than most ever will," she said. "You stood when others turned their heads. You spoke when silence was easier. That matters. That counts." The door opened again, and a voice called out that visiting time was up. Ruth stood slowly, her movements deliberate, her gaze steady. "They may have broken your phone," she said, adjusting her cardigan, "but they didn't break your word. Hold on to that." Back in her cell, the quiet returned like a tide, filling the space left behind by Jamal's departure. She sat again on the bench, this time with a little less stiffness in her posture. The conversation had stirred something inside her, not comfort, but clarity. The walls around her might have been built to contain, but her spirit hadn't signed the same agreement. Hours later, when the door opened once more and the officer told her she was being released, she didn't ask why. She didn't ask who signed the paper or what had changed. She knew better than to believe freedom meant justice. Instead, she stepped into the hallway, shoulders back, chin raised, and walked through the precinct like she was leaving a room she never belonged in to begin with. Outside, the air smelled like rain on concrete, and the sky had shifted from pale gray to the deep purple of a setting sun. Elijah was waiting by his car, arms folded, a shadow under his eyes, tension in his jaw. As she approached, he opened the passenger door without a word, and she climbed in the leather seat, soft against her tired frame. For a while they didn't speak. The engine rumbled, the streetlights flickered on, and the city moved around them like nothing had happened. Eventually, Elijah broke the silence. "They're building a case," he said. "Something deeper than Knox. There's a pattern, Ma. I just didn't see it soon enough." Ruth reached for his hand, gave it a small squeeze. "You see it now," she said simply. "And that's what matters." As the car pulled away from the curb, Ruth turned to look back one last time, not at the building, not at the officers, but at the people gathering across the street. Some held signs, some held phones, and some just stood there, quiet but present, refusing to look away. And in that final glance, Ruth felt something shift, not in the system, not in the power structure, but in the people watching it all unfold. Because sometimes justice doesn't begin in courtrooms or policy memos. Sometimes it begins when someone simply refuses to sit down. The courtroom was colder than Ruth expected, not the kind of cold that comes from the air conditioning, but the kind that seeps through polished marble floors and settles into your bones like an uninvited guest. Everything was white-gray or a muted brown, and the chairs were lined up in tidy rows, too hard to be comfortable, too close together to feel private. The seal of the state loomed above the judge's bench, etched in gold and hanging heavy like a reminder that justice, at least here, wore a robe and spoke from elevation. Ruth sat beside Grace Harper, who shuffled through a manila folder with quiet intensity, her lips pressed into a line and her brow furrowed in silent calculation. Across the aisle, Officer Knox sat at the prosecution table, not in uniform this time, but in a tailored navy suit that looked borrowed, his hair slicked back and his expression as smug as ever. The gallery behind them was nearly full, an unusual turnout for an arraignment hearing, but the tension in the town had brought people out, neighbors, church members, old students, and a handful of reporters with cameras hanging like pendulums on their necks. Some of them whispered, others sat in silence, and more than a few turned to glance at Ruth every few minutes, their faces tight with worry or expectation or both. She didn't flinch under their gaze. She sat with her hands folded over her lap, her back straight and her eyes locked forward. This wasn't her first fight, and she didn't come to shrink. The judge entered briskly, a tall white man in his late 50s, with the kind of practiced composure that gave away nothing. "Call the case," he said, and the clerk's voice rang out like a bell. "State of North Carolina, versus Ruth Ellington. Just hearing her name like that formal stripped of warmth carried a sting she hadn't quite prepared for. But Grace leaned toward her and whispered, "Don't worry, we've got this." Ruth gave a slow nod, her pulse steady, her expression unshaken. The prosecutor rose, a thin woman in a black skirt suit, clutching a legal pad with a red pen wedged between her fingers. She spoke with confidence, laying out a version of events that twisted reality into something unrecognizable. She claimed Ruth had interfered with an ongoing investigation, that she had resisted a lawful order, and that her behavior had escalated the situation. Each word felt like a small cut, not because they hurt individually, but because of how casually they were delivered, how easily the truth had been scrubbed from the record. When it was Grace's turn, she stood without fanfare, walked to the center of the courtroom, and began speaking not to the judge, but to the people watching. "My client," she said, "is a retired school teacher. She was assaulted without cause, humiliated in her own neighborhood, and arrested under a false pretense to protect a lie. We have video, Your Honor. We have eyewitnesses. What we do not have is justice yet." Her voice didn't rise, but it carried weight, threading between the silence like a current of clear, unflinching truth. She moved back to her seat, eyes scanning the judge's face for any flicker of reaction, but he gave none. Then came the evidence. Grace played the cell phone footage captured by Jamal, the shaky but undeniable video that showed Knox standing over Ruth, yelling, pushing, then forcing her to the ground. The courtroom shifted. Murmurs rose and fell. The prosecutor objected, tried to discredit the angle, but the damage had been done. The truth was in the room now, and it had taken form. A few witnesses testified, one by one, including a young woman who had been walking her dog nearby and a middle-aged man who lived across the street. Their stories matched Ruth's, and their tone was firm. No embellishment, no theatrics, just clarity. She wasn't yelling, one said. She didn't touch him. He just snapped. Ruth listened to them, speak with quiet gratitude, letting the strength of their words fortify the parts of her that had grown tired. Then, in a move none of them had expected, the prosecution called Officer Brandon Ellis, Knox's former partner who had remained quiet throughout the internal review. He stepped up to the witness stand in full uniform, his posture stiff, his eyes darting between the prosecution and the defense. When asked to describe what happened, he hesitated. The silence stretched long enough to make the judge glance down at him. And then, with a shaky breath, Ellis spoke. "I turned off my body cam," he said, his voice low. "He told me to. Said she was making a scene and that we had to handle it quietly. I didn't see her hit anyone. I didn't see her resist. I saw him push her. I saw him force her down." The room went still. The judge leaned forward slightly, his face no longer blank. The prosecutor looked like she'd swallowed glass. Grace blinked once, then slowly sat up straighter in her seat. And Ruth closed her eyes for half a moment, letting the weight of those words settle into her chest like a prayer finally heard. By the time the judge called for a recess, the mood in the courtroom had shifted completely. The gallery buzzed with tension, reporters scribbled notes with renewed urgency, and Knox, whose smirk had long since vanished, sat with clenched fists and a hollow expression. Outside, people gathered by the courthouse steps, holding signs that read, "Justice for Ruth and we are watching." The wind rustled through them, gently lifting the corners of cardboard and the edges of hope. Ruth stepped outside with Grace and Elijah flanking her, the cameras flashing as soon as she reached the top step. Someone asked how she felt, another asked what she wanted to say. She paused, took a breath, and spoke calmly. "I want to thank those who spoke the truth," she said. "Not just today, but every day. It wasn't easy. This isn't over, but it's begun." Elijah placed a hand gently on her back, guiding her down the steps. "You did good, Ma," he said softly. Ruth nodded her eyes, scanning the crowd, not for approval but for the faces that reminded her she wasn't alone. She saw Jamal near the back, raising 2 fingers in silent respect, and she returned the gesture with a smile that held no bitterness, only pride. They reached the car, and as Ruth settled into her seat, she looked up at the courthouse one last time. The building stood tall and unmoved, but for the first time, it no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a place where stories once buried had been forced into the light. And as they drove away, the reflection of the setting sun caught in the glass of the rear window, painting Ruth's face in gold. She closed her eyes and let it warm her skin, not as an ending but as a sign that something long frozen had finally begun to thaw. The courthouse steps had barely cooled from Ruth's exit when the story began to move faster than anyone could control, flowing like a river fed by 100 hidden streams, carrying voices, questions, and truths that no one could ignore anymore. By mid-morning the next day, the video had gone from neighborhood screens to national broadcasts, replayed in full with commentary from anchors whose carefully neutral tones couldn't hide their disbelief. The headlines varied, some called it misconduct, others brutality, and a few used the word shame, but all of them pointed in one direction: something was wrong, and the system had been caught pretending it wasn't. At the precinct, the mood was taut, as if every fluorescent light hummed a little louder, and every step down the hallway echoed too sharply. Elijah sat in a conference room with Grace Harper and a detective from Internal Affairs named Ron Haynes, a lean, quiet man who spoke softly but looked like he didn't miss much. The walls around them were covered in gray pinboards and dry erase calendars, half filled with tasks that no longer seemed urgent. On the table between them lay a thick folder of complaints, some handwritten, some typed, spanning the past 5 years. Each one had been filed against Officer Knox, or officers linked to his shift. Most were marked with a red stamp, closed. Insufficient evidence. No action taken. Grace flipped slowly through the pages, her fingers gliding over the names. Mostly black, mostly poor, mostly people who hadn't had lawyers or cameras or anyone to follow up. "This isn't just a bad apple," she said quietly. "This is a pattern, a structure that lets him operate like this and buries the mess when it surfaces." Elijah nodded, his jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the names like they were bricks laid on a path he wished he'd seen sooner. "I trained some of these officers," he said. "I vouched for them. I built this house and I didn't even see the rot in the foundation." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone sifting through the debris of his own blind spots, trying to name what he'd missed before it hardened into silence. Detective Haynes leaned forward, his hands folded together. "We're reopening those cases," he said. "But that comes with risk. We need someone from the inside to verify these weren't just procedural mistakes but deliberate cover-ups." Elijah didn't hesitate. "You've got me," he said. "Whatever you need." Grace glanced sideways at him, her expression unreadable. "This isn't just going to ruffle feathers," she murmured. "It's going to pull up floorboards." Outside, the courthouse had turned into something closer to a town square. People gathered daily not just to protest but to hold space, bringing lawn chairs, thermoses, speakers, playing old Sam Cooke songs. Some held signs, others brought folding tables and passed out food. The tone was angry, yes, but also rooted in something deeper, collective, knowing communal memory, a sense that this wasn't new, only newly visible. When Ruth stepped outside her house to check the mail, people waved from porches or slowed their cars to honk once in solidarity. She didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't do interviews. But she nodded sometimes with a hand pressed to her heart, like she was receiving each gesture like a stone laid at her feet, proof she wasn't walking this alone. Jamal, the young man who had recorded the initial footage, had become something of a lightning rod. His social media following exploded overnight, and while most of the attention came from support, not all of it was kind. "You're trying to be famous off her pain," someone commented. "You think a video makes you a hero," others said. At first he didn't answer, didn't know how to. But one evening he sat on the hood of his car outside his grandmother's house and spoke into the camera, not with rehearsed sound bites, but with the quiet clarity of someone who had seen too much too fast. "I didn't record that video to go viral," he said. "I recorded it because I was scared. Because I knew if nobody filmed it, they'd say it didn't happen. And I'd rather live with trolls than live with that silence." Back inside the courthouse, a hearing was scheduled to determine whether the charges against Ruth would be formally dismissed or allowed to linger under the guise of further review. Grace prepared for the worst, while hoping for something close to decent. But what no one expected was the arrival of a former precinct clerk, Maria Denson, who had kept copies of several reports that had never been logged properly. She'd kept them at home, she said, because she didn't trust the filing system anymore. "I didn't know what to do back then," she said tearfully on the witness stand, "but when I saw Miss Ruth on the news, I couldn't keep it to myself any longer." Her testimony shifted everything. By the end of the day, the judge had not only dismissed the remaining charges against Ruth, but formally recommended a review of the precinct's internal procedures. Knox, now facing both criminal and civil investigations, was taken into custody, his bond revoked due to risk of flight. He didn't look at Ruth as he was led out, didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't lift his head. Elijah watched from the side of the courtroom, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the man he once called colleague. He didn't feel joy. He didn't feel victory. What he felt was something slower and harder to name, like the first gust of clean air, after days of smoke, welcome but never enough. That night, back at Ruth's house, the kitchen was warm and full. Grace poured coffee into mismatched mugs. Jamal sat on the back steps talking quietly to two elderly neighbors. A few church friends dropped off cornbread and sweet potatoes, insisting they didn't need to stay. Elijah stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the porch light flicker in the reflection of the glass. Ruth moved between them all with quiet ease, her limp a little more, pronounced her breath a little shorter, but her presence as grounded as ever. She refolded napkins, refilled cups, and finally sat at the table, her fingers lightly tapping the edge. "They thought I'd be too old to fight back," she said, her voice soft but unshaken. "But I've buried too many friends, seen too many lies, lived through too much truth not to stand." Elijah sat across from her, his face softer, now the storm in his chest quieter. "You didn't just stand, Ma," he said. "You moved the ground under them." And in that room, under the hum of the kitchen light, surrounded by people who had chosen truth over comfort, Ruth allowed herself the smallest, rarest thing. She smiled. Not wide, not for the cameras, just enough for herself. The press conference wasn't planned, but there came a point when silence began to feel more dangerous than speaking, and Grace Harper, poised behind a wooden podium just outside the courthouse steps, knew the moment had arrived. The microphones pointed at her like steel petals, and the crowd beyond them shifted restlessly, their breaths visible in the morning, chill, their questions heavy even before they were asked. Ruth stood to the side, not behind her like a prop, but beside her like a witness who'd already said everything without uttering a single word. She wore a long gray coat that hung loose at the shoulders, and a navy scarf tucked carefully beneath her collar, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, not to conceal herself, but to remind them she could see without giving anything away. The questions came fast and sharp like needles piercing the edge of control. Will there be civil charges filed? Does this reflect a systemic problem? How is Miss Ellington responding to the latest revelations? Grace answered them with the kind of calm precision that came from having nothing left to fear. "We are reviewing all options," she said. "The community deserves full transparency. And yes, what happened here is part of something larger. This isn't the fault of one man, it's the fault of a system that protects him." Behind the cameras, Elijah stood with his arms folded, his badge no longer clipped to his belt, but still heavy in his pocket, reminding him with every step that the uniform meant something different now. The headlines had shifted from doubt to outrage, from alleged misconduct to community uprising, and somewhere in the middle, his name had become synonymous with whistleblower, though he had never intended to carry that title. He had simply followed the evidence one document at a time until the whole rotten structure had started to sag under the weight of its own secrets. Later that evening, Ruth sat alone in her living room, a single lamp casting a golden haze across the hardwood floor, her cane resting by the armrest of her chair like an old friend waiting for conversation. The noise outside had faded into distant murmurs, cars slowing footsteps on pavement, the occasional shout from a neighbor still fired up by the day's events. But inside, everything was still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from absence but from presence so full it needs no movement to make itself known. She held a letter in her lap, folded carefully in thirds, the paper soft from being opened and closed too many times. It was a letter from a woman in Arkansas, someone she'd never met who'd seen the footage on the news and written by hand because, as she put it, emails don't carry heart the same way ink does. The letter was simple, full of warmth and reverence and a kind of quiet apology, not for what happened, but for what had been allowed to happen for so long without interruption. Ruth traced one finger along the crease of the paper, her eyes softening as she read the last line again. "You reminded me that dignity is not something they can take unless we give it." She closed the letter, slowly folded it once more, and placed it in a wooden box near her bookshelf next to old photographs and birthday cards from decades past. Not because it belonged to the past, but because it now belonged to the same lineage of survival. Across town, Elijah sat in his car outside the precinct, the dashboard clock glowing quietly in the dark, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel in a rhythm that never fully resolved. He hadn't told Ruth he was going, didn't want her to worry, but he needed to see it with his own eyes, needed to look at the building that had once meant safety and structure and now looked more like a shell. There were rumors that more officers would be named. Some were already on suspension. Others had disappeared into sudden medical leave. The blue wall was cracking, and he knew the next blow might not come from outside but from within. He stepped out of the car and walked to the steps, not to go inside, but just to stand there, to feel the stone under his shoes, and breathe the air that still carried the faint echo of Ruth's name. The street was quiet, but not empty. A small candle had been left on the sidewalk, still burning its flame steady despite the wind, and beside it, a note scribbled in marker, "We believe you." No name, no signature. Just 5 words floating like a vow in the cold night air. Back at Ruth's house, she moved to the window and drew back the curtain slightly, her eyes scanning the yard with the instinct of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning where to look before opening the door. The moonlight spilled across the grass, silver and soft, and she could see the porch swaying gently, moved not by footsteps but by wind and memory. She let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the kitchen. The kettle began to whistle sharp at first, then softening into something more like a lullaby. She poured the water slowly, her hands steady, and dropped a tea bag into the mug with the kind of care only age can teach. As the steam rose, so did the rhythm of her thoughts, memories of her husband's quiet laughter, her son's first day in uniform, the ache in her knees after long days, standing in classrooms, teaching history that too often left women like her out of the story. She carried the mug back to the living room, settled again into her chair, and took one slow sip, letting the heat fill the spaces that the cold of the courtroom hadn't yet reached. She didn't think of revenge. She didn't dwell on shame. What lingered now was something quieter, more enduring, a sense of return, not to comfort but to clarity. She looked around the room at the books on the shelf, the family photos lining the mantel, the soft hum of the refrigerator carrying through the walls like a heartbeat, and she thought, not for the first time, "I'm still here," and that she realized was its own kind of justice, quiet, complete, unapologetically whole. The day Officer Knox was arrested, the sky was overcast, but calm, the kind of gray that hung low without threatening rain, casting everything beneath it in a soft, muted tone like the world itself was holding its breath. It was early afternoon when the news broke first, as a headline crawling across the bottom of local news screens, then as a notification lighting up the phones of those who had followed Ruth's story from the beginning. Former Officer Bradley Knox, taken into custody, following perjury allegations and civil rights violations, the headline read. There was no fanfare, no dramatic chase or resistance, just a quiet surrender at the edge of a career he thought would protect him from consequences forever. And though Ruth hadn't asked for vengeance, though she never spoke his name with bitterness, there was no denying what that moment meant. Elijah was standing in the hallway outside the courtroom when he got the call, his phone buzzing gently against his palm like it knew the gravity of what waited on the other end. He answered without a word, listened as Internal Affairs confirmed that Knox had been taken into federal custody after a cooperating witness came forward, someone inside the department who could no longer look in the mirror. He didn't smile, didn't pump his fist, didn't celebrate. Instead, he leaned against the wall, closed his eyes for a long breath, and let the weight of it settle deep in his chest. Back at Ruth's house, the phone had been ringing since morning, neighbors checking in, old friends calling from other cities, even a young reporter who had once been her student now working in Charlotte. She sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of half-eaten oatmeal growing cold in front of her, the voices from the television in the living room filtering through the walls like a low hum. She didn't answer the phone anymore. Elijah had told her to let it go to voicemail, said the story would run its course, and the noise would eventually fade. But Ruth knew better. Some noise never left it, just settled beneath the floorboards, waiting for the next footstep to stir it back to life. She looked down at the newspaper in her hand, not the front page, but the editorial tucked toward the back, a letter from a retired judge praising her dignity, her restraint, her powerful example of quiet resistance. Ruth had circled one line in particular. Sometimes the most profound power comes not from action but from endurance. She traced that sentence with her finger, not to reread it, but to remember it, to press it into memory like a seed she might water later. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, stirring the branches of the magnolia tree in her front yard. The same tree her husband had planted 30 years ago, back when the house was still new to them, when the world felt a little wider and the future seemed less heavy. Its leaves had begun to fall now, not in clusters but one at a time, slow and deliberate, each one floating to the ground like a quiet punctuation mark. Elijah arrived just after 3, his footsteps heavy against the porch, his hand resting briefly on the railing before he opened the door. He carried a folder under one arm and the weariness of the last few weeks across his shoulders. Ruth didn't ask about the arrest. She didn't need the details. She just nodded as he walked in and said, "You look tired." He smiled faintly, set the folder on the table, and poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher she'd left out that morning. "I am," he said, "but it's a good kind of tired today." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't press or pull, just settles gently in the space between two people who've already said what needs saying. Then almost absently Elijah opened the folder and slid a document toward her. "It's from the city," he explained. "An official apology. They're planning a resolution to honor you at the next council meeting." Ruth looked at the paper, read the formal language, the legal phrases softened by paragraphs of public regret. She didn't scoff or dismiss it, but neither did she reach for it. "They think a resolution fixes it?" she asked quietly. "Fixes what they let him do?" Elijah shook his head. "No, Ma, but it's a start, and more people will hear the truth because of it." She nodded slowly, her eyes lingering on the paper, then drifting toward the window. Outside, 2 children rode their bikes down the street, one with training wheels still clattering over the sidewalk, the other laughing loudly as he turned the corner. Ruth watched them with a tenderness that came not from nostalgia, but from knowing how easily innocence can be interrupted. "You think they'll remember this?" she asked softly. 10 years from now, when someone else gets pulled aside for nothing, when a badge gets used like a weapon instead of a shield?" Elijah followed her gaze, watching the children disappear out of view. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think they'll remember you." That evening the house grew quiet again, the sunlight stretching longer across the floorboards, casting soft gold across the rug and the edges of the worn coffee table. Ruth moved slowly through the room, turning off lamps, straightening cushions, wiping down surfaces that didn't need cleaning. She wasn't restless, just thoughtful, just moving with the kind of care that comes from knowing every action holds weight, even the small ones. Before heading to bed, she paused at the bookshelf near the front window. Nestled between a stack of novels and an old family Bible was a small wooden box. She opened it gently, pulled out the letter from Arkansas, and unfolded it once more. The handwriting was just as neat, just as deliberate, and as she read those final words again, "You reminded me that dignity is not something they can take unless we give it." Ruth smiled a little wider, this time the kind that doesn't need witnesses to matter. She turned off the last light, cane in hand, and walked toward the hallway with slow, steady steps. Not triumphant, not weary, just rooted, just whole. And as she disappeared into the quiet of the night, the wind outside rustled the magnolia leaves one more time, like the world itself was sighing in recognition. The day Ruth was honored by the city began with a soft rain that swept gently across the streets like a blessing, not enough to soak the sidewalks, but just enough to clean them, to remind the town of how quiet renewal can be. The ceremony was scheduled for late afternoon, and by noon the clouds had begun to part, leaving streaks of light that filtered through the courthouse windows like long forgiving fingers. Inside, workers moved with quiet purpose, adjusting the microphone on the podium, setting out folding chairs in even rows, laying down a carpet over the courthouse steps, as if the ground itself needed softening for the occasion. There was no red carpet, just deep blue, a shade that felt steadier, truer, something more grounded in dignity than spectacle. Ruth stood by her bedroom window, adjusting a simple pearl earring with the same careful attention she gave to everything she wore. Nothing extravagant, just deliberate, respectful, as though her presence was the only statement she needed to make. Her navy dress was freshly pressed, her silver hair brushed back and pinned at the nape of her neck, and her cane leaned silently beside the dresser, waiting as always to be the last thing she touched before leaving. In the mirror, she studied her reflection for a moment, not out of vanity, but to check the lines around her mouth, the curve of her shoulders, the depth in her eyes. She wasn't looking for age. She was looking for readiness. "I don't need them to like me," she said softly to herself, just to listen. Downstairs, Elijah was pacing in the hallway, checking his watch out of habit, smoothing the sleeves of his gray blazer for the 3rd time. He had offered to drive, insisted really, but Ruth had told him gently, "I've walked to harder places in worse shoes, son. Let me walk this one my way." So he settled for meeting her at the car, opening the door with a reverence that said more than words. "You look strong," he said simply. "You always say that," she replied, easing herself into the seat because you want it to be true. They arrived just as the first people began to gather the crowd, a mix of neighbors, church friends, former students, city officials, and strangers who had only known Ruth through the screen, but felt somehow that they had always known her. Signs weren't allowed at the event, but still, someone held a small handmade placard close to their chest that read, "Strength looks like this." There were no chants were needed, only presence. Quiet, steady, undeniable presence. The mayor was the first to speak. He stood behind the podium with practiced formality, offering an apology that had taken too long and a praise that couldn't fully stretch to cover the harm done. His words were measured, his tone respectful, and though his speechwriters had written every syllable, Ruth heard sincerity beneath the rehearsed cadence. He ended with a resolution passed unanimously, declaring a new city initiative for accountability named in her honor. There was a standing ovation, polite, but sustained a rising wave of something like healing beginning to take root. When they called Ruth to the microphone, she moved slowly, but without hesitation, her cane tapping softly against the wooden steps, her posture straight despite the ache in her knees and the weight of every eye in the courtyard. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. Her voice, when it came, was clear, not loud, not dramatic, just calm and deeply human. "I didn't ask for this," she began, "and I didn't want what happened to me to happen to anyone. But when it did, I made a decision not to be silent, not to bow. Not because I thought I was brave, but because I remembered my mother's voice and my grandmother's hands and the lives of people who stood before I ever had the chance to." She paused, let the stillness settle over the courtyard like a warm blanket. "I wasn't the first, and I won't be the last. But I was here, and I made sure they couldn't pretend I wasn't." Applause rose again, slower, this time more personal, like people weren't clapping for a speech, they were clapping for every moment she had carried herself through alone. Elijah stepped forward, offering his arm, and together they descended the steps side by side. Reporters called her name, asking questions she didn't answer, not out of defiance but out of clarity. She had already said everything she needed to say. That evening, the house filled with people, friends who brought food and laughter and old memories filling the kitchen with the clatter of dishes and the smells of fried chicken and cornbread, the sound of gospel playing faintly from a speaker in the living room. Elijah poured sweet tea for his mother and helped carry extra chairs from the garage. His shirt sleeves rolled up his tie, loosened his face, finally relaxed in a way Ruth hadn't seen in weeks. Jamal arrived late, holding a stack of printed photo stills from the video he'd taken, now framed with small captions beneath them. He handed them to Ruth quietly, not as a gift but as a record. "I wanted you to have these," he said, "so nobody forgets how it started." She looked down at them, eyes tracing the frozen images, her hand clutching her cane, her face turned upward, her son stepping between her and injustice like a bridge built in real time. She didn't cry. She just nodded, then reached out and pulled Jamal into a hug that felt like home. As the night wound down and the house emptied, Ruth stepped out onto the front porch alone. The sky was clear now, the stars unbothered by ceremony, shining with the same quiet brilliance they always had. She sat on the porch swing, letting it rock slowly beneath her, the wood creaking in time with her breath. The magnolia tree in the yard stood still, its branches no longer trembling, its shadow soft against the grass. And there in that stillness, Ruth closed her eyes, not to escape the moment, but to settle into it fully, like a chapter finally ending, not with a door slammed shut, but with one gently closed by hand. And in the hush of that soft southern night, she thought only this: I am not just what happened to me, I am what I chose to become after. It had been 2 weeks since the ceremony and the town had started to quiet again, not in the way of forgetting, but in the way that follows a storm, when people begin returning to their own corners of life, carrying with them pieces of what they witnessed but unsure where to place them. Ruth moved through her days with the same gentle rhythm she always had, watering the houseplants in the front window, folding linens with precision, boiling water for tea every afternoon at 4, as though the world hadn't shifted beneath her feet. And yet something had changed, not just in the town or in the headlines, but in her own body, in the way she breathed when stepping outside, in the way her name sounded when strangers now said it with something close to reverence. The front porch had become a sanctuary again. She sat there most evenings wrapped in her light sweater, despite the warmth, her cane resting nearby her eyes, following the lines of the street, not as a prisoner of memory but as someone who had chosen to stay. Cars passed more slowly now. Some honked gently. Others stopped altogether, their drivers waving with soft smiles or nods that said more than any words might. It wasn't fame. Ruth didn't want fame. What it felt like was recognition not of what had been done to her, but of what she had endured without losing the shape of herself in the process. Elijah came by often, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes nothing at all but his company. He no longer wore his badge, though his name was still listed on the department's internal review panel. He had requested that assignment deliberately, wanting to be part of what came next, not out of duty to the system but out of love, for something deeper, justice, yes, but also atonement. On this particular afternoon he sat beside his mother on the porch, sipping coffee from the mug she'd given him years ago, the one that read "World's Okayest Son" in chipped navy letters. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, not accusingly, but with quiet curiosity. "About selling the house, starting fresh somewhere else." Ruth didn't answer immediately. She took a slow sip from her own cup, her eyes resting on the old magnolia tree in the yard, its thick branches swaying just slightly in the breeze. "I've lived in this house longer than some people keep marriages," she said. "I've poured coffee on that kitchen counter through joy and through heartbreak. I've buried a husband, raised a child, taught myself how to sleep alone in that upstairs room. If I leave now, who would I be doing it for?" Elijah nodded slowly, letting the words settle between them. "I just don't want you to feel trapped," he said. "Like you're staying out of obligation." Ruth smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with the kind of affection that comes from watching someone try to carry a burden that isn't theirs to hold. "I'm not trapped," she replied. "I'm rooted. There's a difference." Later that evening, after Elijah had left and the porch light had begun to flicker on its own, Ruth received a letter in the mail, no return address, just a postmark from Louisiana. Inside was a photograph of a young woman standing on the steps of a courthouse that looked strikingly familiar. Her arms raised a small crowd behind her, holding signs that read, "Protect our mothers," and "Justice is a direction, not a place." There was a short note scribbled on the back of the photo, "You gave us the courage to speak." Ruth ran her fingers across the glossy surface, feeling the weight of it like a whisper pressed into her palm. She placed the photo gently on her mantel next to the framed picture of Elijah in uniform and the worn portrait of her husband from their church's 35th anniversary. The three images sat together like chapters in a story she never set out to write, but somehow lived into each one, holding its own space without demanding the spotlight. She stepped back, looked at them for a long moment, then nodded once, as if in quiet agreement with something only she could hear. The town had started holding community forums in the school gymnasium, open to all, moderated by volunteers, often filled with tension and overlap and too many voices speaking at once. Ruth had been invited more than once, but she hadn't gone, not because she didn't care, but because she knew the difference between standing on principle and becoming a symbol too large to breathe. But one night, as she passed by the gym on her way home from the market, she paused at the doorway, drawn by the sound of a young girl speaking into a microphone, her voice cracking slightly but holding strong. "My grandmother told me," the girl said, "that we come from women who don't wait to be rescued." A small ripple of applause followed. Ruth stood at the threshold unseen and allowed herself one full breath of pride before continuing home, her groceries tucked neatly into the basket of her walker, her steps steady and sure on the pavement she knew by heart. That night she opened the windows before bed, letting the breeze move through the curtains like a familiar spirit come to sit with her. The house creaked gently in the dark, not from age but from memory, from every conversation it had held between these walls, from every silence it had protected. She turned off the lights one by one, moved through the hallway, slowly, her hand brushing the railing as she climbed the stairs, not out of need but out of ritual. In her bedroom, she changed into her nightgown, folded her clothes carefully on the chair beside the dresser, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment before pulling back the covers. Her hand reached for the switch on the nightstand lamp, and she paused, letting her eyes adjust to the soft shadows falling across the floor. She looked out the window, past the porch, past the magnolia tree, up into the wide-open sky, and in that moment, alone but not lonely, changed but not diminished, Ruth whispered to herself, "I'm still here." And that truth, spoken quietly in the dark, felt more powerful than anything a courtroom or camera could ever capture. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply stand their ground with dignity, with patience, and with quiet courage. Ruth's story reminds us that justice isn't always loud, and it doesn't always come quickly, but when we carry ourselves with truth, we plant seeds that others will water. Especially for those of us who've lived long enough to see cycles repeat, it's easy to feel like nothing changes, but every time we speak up or simply refuse to be erased, we help shift something forward. You don't need to march in the streets or make speeches to make a difference. Sometimes just staying rooted in who you are is enough to shake the walls of power. And no matter your age, your presence matters. Your story matters. You are not invisible. So take a deep breath, hold your head high, and know this: your strength, your lived wisdom isn't behind you. It's with you, and it's still making waves. If Ruth's story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or something you've lived through, don't let it stop here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet strength can change the world. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter, especially for voices that deserve to be heard. So stay with us, because every time you click, comment, or share, you help bring light to the truth.